It's been the worst time of my life, Joe. If somebody accused me of raping them or hurting them, I have a 22-year-old daughter. I would never hurt anyone.
If you've watched movies or television over the last 3 decades, you have seen Clifton Powell's face. Maybe you didn't know his name. Maybe you couldn't place exactly which film it was. But the face stuck with you, the intensity in his eyes, the way he could turn menacing in one scene and warm in the next, the sense that whatever character he was playing, he actually meant it. More than 100 credits across film and television. Roles alongside Jamie Foxx, Ice Cube, Denzel Washington, Chris Tucker. A career most actors spend a lifetime chasing and never catch. And yet, for years, Clifton Powell carried something most of his fans never knew about. An accusation that was never proven. A case that the courts eventually threw out entirely. And a shadow that Hollywood refused to let go of, long after the legal system had already moved on. This is the story of how a dismissed allegation nearly ended a 30-year career, and what that says about the difference between being innocent in a courtroom and being innocent in the public eye. Because those two things, it turns out, are not the same thing at all. Let's start at the beginning, because you cannot understand what happened to Clifton Powell later in his career without understanding where he came from. Clifton Powell's story does not start on a movie set. It starts in Southeast Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood that gave a lot of kids 2 options: get out or get swallowed up. He was only 4 years old when his mother passed away. His father was left to raise him, but his father was also struggling with alcoholism, and he could not give a young boy the kind of stability a child needs to feel safe in the world. So Powell grew up fast. He grew up watching friends around him get pulled into the streets, into gangs, into jail cells, into early graves. He has said, in interviews looking back on that time, that survival meant leaning on the handful of people who refused to give up on him, a few mentors, a few family members who stepped in when his own household couldn't hold things together. Most kids who grow up in that kind of environment don't make it out. Powell did. And he didn't just make it out, he built an entirely different life for himself, 3,000 miles away, in an industry that had absolutely no reason to give a kid from Southeast DC a chance. His breakout came in 1993, in a film called Menace to Society. If you know the film, you know it wasn't a glossy, feel-good introduction to Hollywood. It was raw. It was violent. It captured the harsh, unfiltered realities of street life in a way that few films before it had dared to. And Powell, in that film, brought something real to the screen, an intensity that clearly wasn't acting technique alone. It was lived experience. Casting directors noticed. Audiences noticed. From there, Powell didn't get boxed into one type of role, which is rare in this industry. He became one of the most reliable character actors working in Hollywood, sliding effortlessly from hard-edged dramatic work into full comedic timing. He became a fixture in the Friday franchise, delivering some of the funniest, sharpest line deliveries in a series that has become a comfort watch for an entire generation. Then he'd turn around and deliver something completely different: quiet menace, controlled anger, grief, in a dramatic role. That range is what directors and casting agents kept coming back for. It's rare for an actor to be equally convincing as a villain, a father figure, a hustler, and a cop. Powell could do all 4, sometimes in the same year. By 2004, that range paid off in a big way. Powell landed a role in Ray, the acclaimed Jamie Foxx biopic about the life of Ray Charles. Powell played Jeff Brown, Ray Charles's loyal road manager, not a flashy role, but a foundational one, the kind of performance that holds a film together while the lead actor gets the spotlight. Powell's performance was strong enough to earn him an NAACP Image Award nomination. Think about what that means in an industry that, historically, has not been generous with recognition for character actors, especially black character actors working steadily rather than headlining. That nomination wasn't just a nice moment. It was validation from an institution built specifically to recognize black excellence that his work mattered. Along the way, Powell built out a filmography that reads like a highlight reel of late 90s and 2000s black cinema. Dead Presidents, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, Rush Hour, Next Friday. Over 100 credits by the time it was all counted up. Directors and producers called him when they needed someone who could walk into a scene and make it feel real without needing 3 pages of backstory explained to the audience first. That's not a small skill. That's decades of craft. But here's the thing about steady, hard-won success in Hollywood: it can be undone faster than it was built. And for Powell, 2 very different forces were quietly working against everything he had built. One was systemic. The other was personal, sudden, and devastating. Let's talk about both, because you cannot fully understand Clifton Powell's career without understanding the barriers he faced even at the height of his success. Powell has spoken openly, more than once, about facing colorism throughout his career in Hollywood. Colorism, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, refers to discrimination based on skin tone, often within the same racial or ethnic group, where lighter skin is treated as more desirable, more marketable, more relatable to a broader audience. Powell has described being told outright by producers and network executives that he was too dark for certain roles. In one particularly painful account, he recalled being told that his complexion might scare viewers away from a leading part. Sit with that for a second. Here is a man who was consistently praised, by critics, by directors, by audiences, for his ability to bring intensity and menace to a role. And the very same industry that valued him for that intensity would then turn around and quietly pass him over the moment a role called for warmth, for romance, for vulnerability. That's not a coincidence. That's a documented pattern that darker-skinned black actors have described for generations in this industry, an unofficial rule where marketability gets tied to how closely a face fits a narrow, historically Eurocentric idea of what a leading man is supposed to look like. It rarely gets said in those exact words in a casting room. It gets dressed up in softer language, market concerns, target demographics, creative vision. But actors who've lived through it, like Powell, know exactly what that language is covering for. And Powell didn't just quietly absorb this. He spoke up. In one notable instance, he found himself publicly at odds with director Spike Lee, after Lee made comments Powell felt were unfairly harsh toward another black actor in the mainstream press. Powell didn't hold back his response. He said plainly that he had no respect, not for anyone, not for himself, not even for his own son or daughter, if they went to the mainstream press to tear down a fellow black entertainer who was just trying to succeed in a business that already made success difficult enough to reach. That's not the response of someone chasing headlines. That's the response of someone who understood, from hard experience, how much harder the road already was without artists tearing each other down publicly for a cheap news cycle. That's the man underneath the filmography, someone who fought against systemic bias while also trying to hold the door open for others behind him. Now here's where the story takes a much harder turn. In the late summer of 2011, a woman using the pseudonym Keontae Mayers came forward publicly with an accusation against Powell. According to her account, an encounter in a hotel room in New Orleans began consensually and then, in her telling, crossed a line, turning more aggressive than she was comfortable with, and continuing after she said she wanted it to stop. Mayers, who at the time worked as a cocktail waitress at Harrah's Casino, filed a complaint that quickly made its way into the press. Outlets picked it up fast, running it in blunt, attention-grabbing headlines that left very little room for nuance, context, or due process. For Powell, the shift was immediate and brutal. Overnight, the actor audiences knew from Friday and Ray, the guy who made you laugh, the guy whose performance moved you in a serious biopic, was suddenly being discussed in headlines associated with one of the most serious accusations a person can face. Powell denied the accusation immediately, completely, and unequivocally. Through his representative, he issued a public statement stating the claims were false, and that he intended to pursue every legal option available to him against the accusation. And here's the part that a lot of people never hear about, because it doesn't make for as dramatic a headline: the original criminal complaint did not hold up. It was dismissed for lack of evidence. No criminal charges were ever upheld against Clifton Powell. Not then. Not ever. But that was not the end of the ordeal. Not even close. Mayers later pursued a civil case against Powell, seeking financial damages in excess of $75,000. And this is where the story gets legally complicated, in a way that matters enormously to understanding what happened next. A civil case does not operate under the same standard as a criminal case. In criminal court, guilt has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest bar in the American legal system. In civil court, the standard is what's called a preponderance of evidence, meaning, simply, whether it's more likely than not that a claim is true. That's a dramatically lower bar. And it meant that even with no criminal conviction, even with the original criminal complaint dismissed, Powell remained legally entangled in a civil fight that could, and did, drag on for years. Think about what that means for someone whose entire livelihood depends on public reputation. Powell wasn't just defending his freedom, because his freedom was never actually at risk once the criminal case fell apart. He was defending something arguably harder to protect: his name, his image, the trust of an industry that survives on public perception. The civil case consumed years of his life, his time, his money, and by his own account, an enormous amount of emotional energy. For 4 long years, Powell lived under the shadow of that lawsuit, trying to keep his career moving and his personal life intact while lawyers argued the details in courtrooms. In 2017, the case was finally dismissed, with the court finding insufficient evidence to support the claims. In 2018, Powell's own countersuit, for defamation and emotional distress, was also dismissed, closing the entire legal matter on both sides. From a strictly legal standpoint, it was over. Powell had never been convicted of anything. Both his accuser's case and his own countersuit had been thrown out. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely stop you and make you think. None of that legal resolution made the damage disappear. Powell has talked candidly about how quickly Hollywood turned on him the moment the accusation became public, and that reaction happened long before any court had reached any conclusion at all. Secured roles started vanishing. Producers who had already agreed to work with him suddenly grew hesitant, unwilling to risk negative press attaching itself to their project. Powell has described one specific example, a television show where he expected to appear across 6 or 7 episodes, only for his role to quietly disappear after just 2 episodes, with no real explanation given beyond the general discomfort hanging over his name at the time. The financial hit was real. But by Powell's own account, the emotional toll cut even deeper. He has described this period as one of the most painful stretches of his entire life, second only to losing his father years earlier. As a father himself, the accusation wasn't just a threat to his income. It was a threat to how his own children might one day come to view him. He maintained his innocence throughout, publicly and consistently, and the legal system ultimately vindicated that position twice over, once when criminal charges were never upheld, and again when the civil case itself was dismissed for lack of evidence. But innocence in a legal sense doesn't automatically erase suspicion in a cultural sense. It doesn't stop whispers. It doesn't stop strangers looking at you differently when you walk down the street. It doesn't stop anonymous comments online from treating an unproven accusation as an established fact. In an industry, and honestly, in an internet culture, that often reaches a verdict long before any actual court does, Powell found himself serving a kind of sentence that no judge ever handed down. Not a legal sentence. A sentence of reputation. A sentence measured in lost roles, lost trust, and years of career momentum that no dismissal, no matter how legally clean, could ever fully give back to him. That's really the heart of this entire story. Clifton Powell was never convicted of any crime. The courts, both the criminal system and the civil system, closed the book on this case years ago, and closed it in his favor. But public perception doesn't move at the speed of a courtroom. It moves at the speed of a headline, and headlines don't wait around for due process to finish. For Powell, that headline outlived the actual legal case by years, continuing to shape how casting directors, producers, and audiences perceived him long after the legal system had already settled the matter. And as if that wasn't enough weight for one chapter of a person's life to carry, it wasn't happening in isolation. Powell was dealing with serious pressures in his personal life at the exact same time. Hollywood's demands, the constant travel, the long stretches on set, the pull of fame itself, put real strain on his marriage to Kimberly Powell. On the surface, it looked like a stable family. But underneath, the relationship was buckling under the weight of an industry that doesn't leave much room for a normal home life. Eventually, the marriage collapsed, and the divorce hit Powell hard, both emotionally and financially. He has said, candidly, that the divorce cost him roughly $5 million, a staggering loss for anyone, let alone someone trying to simultaneously rebuild a public reputation. Powell has also been open about a gambling habit that compounded his financial troubles during this period, describing losses of $30,000 to $50,000 a year at casinos. What might sound, from the outside, like a minor indulgence for a working actor adds up fast when it's happening year after year, on top of a costly divorce, on top of mounting legal fees from a case that dragged on for the better part of a decade. He's also spoken about being surrounded, during this stretch of his life, by people who were drawn to what he could provide rather than who he actually was, what is described as fake friends and relationships built on proximity to fame rather than any real connection. Maybe the most difficult admission Powell has made publicly is about his own children. He has said plainly that he wasn't present enough for them during this period of his life, that his devotion to work, combined with everything else pulling at his attention, left a gap in his relationship with his own kids that money alone could never fill. He's reflected that being away from home 50% of the time might have been survivable. Being away 70% of the time was too much. That kind of honesty is rare from someone who spent 30 years building a public image for a living, the willingness to admit, out loud, that the private cost of that career was steeper than most people watching from the outside ever realized. Put all of that together, and you start to see the full shape of what Clifton Powell actually lived through during the 2010s. A dismissed criminal complaint. A 4-year civil lawsuit that ultimately went nowhere. A marriage that fell apart under the pressure of the industry itself. A financial hit in the millions. A gambling habit feeding on the instability of everything else happening around it. And underneath all of it, a father wrestling with the reality that his own children were growing up in the middle of headlines he couldn't control. There is no clean villain in this story, and there is no clean, tidy ending either. What there is a 30-year career, built through genuine talent, discipline, and grit, that was nearly derailed, not by a conviction, because there was never a conviction, but by the simple existence of an accusation, and by an entertainment industry quick to distance itself from controversy regardless of what the courts eventually decide. Clifton Powell's story is a reminder of something uncomfortable, but important. In Hollywood, and honestly in most of public life, the perception of guilt can carry more weight than the actual facts of a case. A dismissed lawsuit should, in theory, set someone completely free. In practice, for Powell, it left a lasting scar that outlasted the legal proceedings themselves by years. He built a legacy that most actors in this industry will never come close to. Over 100 credits, iconic roles across comedy and drama, recognition from his peers, and a body of work that has genuinely shaped how audiences remember black cinema from the 90s through today. He built all of that while carrying weight that most of the people watching him on screen never knew was there. A childhood shaped by early loss and instability. A career shaped by both extraordinary talent and the quiet, systemic bias of colorism. A public reputation shaped by an accusation the courts ultimately rejected, twice over, on both sides of the case. Clifton Powell was never found guilty of anything. But in an industry where perception moves faster than truth, he served a sentence anyway. One measured not in years behind bars, because there were none, but in lost roles, lost trust, and years of momentum that talent alone was never going to be enough to buy back. That's the real story behind the headline. Not a man whose career simply ended. A man who survived one of the hardest tests Hollywood can put someone through, and who is still standing, still working, still telling the truth about what it actually cost him to get here. It's worth pausing here and asking a harder question, one that goes beyond Clifton Powell specifically. How many other careers have followed this exact same pattern? An accusation surfaces. The headlines run wild for a news cycle, sometimes two. The court case, if there even is one, takes years to work its way through the system, quietly, methodically, far away from the spotlight that covered the initial accusation. And by the time a dismissal or an acquittal finally comes through, nobody's covering it with anywhere near the same energy. The damage was already done in week one. The vindication, when it finally arrives, barely makes a ripple. That imbalance is not an accident. Accusations are dramatic. They're urgent. They generate clicks, views, and conversation instantly. Dismissals are procedural. They're quiet. They read like a footnote, not a headline. So the public record ends up permanently skewed, not because anyone is lying, necessarily, but because the mechanics of how news spreads simply favor the accusation over the resolution every single time. Powell lived that imbalance for the better part of a decade. 4 years for the civil case to wind through the courts. 2 more years before his own countersuit was resolved. Compare that to the handful of days it took for the original headlines to spread across entertainment news outlets in 2011. And that imbalance matters because of who bears the cost. It's not the outlets that ran the initial headline. It's not the public that formed an opinion in the first week and never revisited it. It's the individual, in this case, an actor who had already spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation one role at a time, who's left to absorb years of lost opportunity while the legal system slowly, correctly, works out what actually happened. Powell has talked about this dynamic in his own words over the years, describing the particular cruelty of being judged by an industry, and by the public, well before any court had the chance to weigh in. He's noted that the accusation alone was often enough, that plenty of people, including some in positions to hire him, never bothered to follow the story closely enough to learn that no criminal charges had ever been upheld against him. They simply remembered the initial headline and moved on with their assumptions intact. That's the mechanism that turned a legally dismissed case into what felt, for years, like a permanent professional setback. It's also worth returning to the range Powell displayed across his filmography, because that range is exactly what got threatened during this period. This is an actor who could shift from villain to father figure to comic relief to law enforcement, often within the same year, sometimes within the same project. That kind of versatility isn't common. Most actors get typecast early and spend a career fighting to break out of one narrow lane. Powell had already broken out of that lane through sheer consistency and range, across projects spanning urban drama, mainstream comedy, awards-caliber biopics, and major studio action films. That's the career that was suddenly at risk of being reduced, in the public imagination, to a single unproven headline from 2011, a career built on decades of range, nearly flattened into one accusation that never even resulted in a conviction. There's also something worth saying about how Powell chose to handle all of this publicly, because it wasn't with bitterness, and it wasn't with silence either. He talked about it. He was honest about the pain of the period, honest about the financial and emotional cost, honest about the mistakes he made in his personal life around the same time, the gambling, the time away from his kids, the strain on his marriage. He didn't try to present himself as a flawless victim of circumstance. He owned the parts of his life that were genuinely his to own, while also being clear and consistent about the parts of the story that the courts themselves ultimately backed him up on, that the accusation against him did not hold up, not in criminal court, and not in civil court either. That combination, accountability about his own mistakes, paired with a clear, unwavering account of what the courts actually found, is part of why his story is worth revisiting now, years later, with a clearer head and the full context available. Not to relitigate 2011. That's already been litigated, twice, and closed both times. But to understand what it actually costs a person to be publicly accused in an industry, and in a media environment, that moves faster than any court ever can. Clifton Powell is still working today. Still showing up on screen, still bringing the same range and intensity that built his career in the first place. That continuity, in itself, says something. A lesser resolve might have walked away from the industry entirely after a decade like that, after the financial losses, after the personal toll, after years of watching opportunities disappear over an accusation that never once resulted in a conviction. Powell didn't walk away. He kept working, kept showing up, kept building on a body of work that was already, by any honest measure, one of the most impressive filmographies of any character actor of his generation. So when you hear a headline that tries to flatten a 30-year career into a single, dramatic legal cliffhanger, it's worth remembering the fuller picture. A childhood in Southeast DC that could have gone 100 different, darker directions. A breakout role built on raw, lived-in talent. A decade of steady, versatile, respected work across some of the most memorable black films of the 90s and 2000s. A recognition from his peers that validated all of it. A period of real personal crisis, legal, financial, emotional, that he came through without ever being convicted of anything. And a body of work that continued, and continues, long after the headlines from 2011 stopped defining the conversation around his name. That's the story. Not guilty and not innocent reduced to a single dramatic word in a title. A far more human, far more complicated truth, of a man who built something real, nearly lost it to forces